What kind of shoes you're going to wear? Golden slippers. What kind of shoes you're going to wear? Golden slippers. Golden slippers. I'm bound to wear the sanctifying song.
You're listening to a recording that's over 100 years old. Even though it was produced in Camden, New Jersey, it has a Nashville connection, and that was way before Nashville became known as Music City, USA. The song has its own history, too. It was originally created by slaves, later popularized by former slaves, and, on occasion, it was even performed at executions.
You know, I always felt if you are hired as a news reporter, you got to tell it like it is. And everybody knew that if I was on a story, that they'd get the exact way it is.
Larry Brinton is an award-winning reporter who worked for the Nashville Banner in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. He covered a lot of the city's big stories, such as the civil rights sit-in protests, the Stringbean killings, and the Marcia Trimble murder. You'll hear about all of these stories and a lot more on this episode of Nashville Retrospect. Welcome to the first episode of the Nashville Retrospect podcast. I'm your host, Allen Forkum. I am also the editor and publisher of the Nashville Retrospect newspaper. We're modeling this show after the Retrospect, so for those of you not familiar with the publication, it is a monthly newspaper chock full of local history, including old newspaper clippings and vintage photographs. Each month, I search through over 200 years' worth of newspaper stories to find enlightening, entertaining, and relevant articles. For example, in our April 2018 issue, we feature original 1968 articles and photographs for the 50th anniversary of the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In the wake of the assassination, rioting erupted in a number of cities, and Nashville was no exception. Mayor Beverly Briley called in the Tennessee National Guard to quell the violence. The state capitol was surrounded by guardsmen, and armored personnel carriers patrolled North Nashville neighborhoods, as you'll see in the photographs. You'll also see a crowd of Nashvillians outside the Metro Courthouse calling for the withdrawal of the military. We also have the 1926 story of 3-year-old Edith Edens. On visiting the girl's home, a neighbor discovered that her father had for weeks been using what was characterized as healing by religious faith to treat the child's pneumonia. The article describes a battle between religious healing and modern science to save the girl's life. Her father and brother were arrested, and Edith was taken to the hospital. Did she survive? You'll have to read my editor's note in the April issue to find out. In 1985, word got out that Tootsie's Orchid Lounge on Lower Broad was shutting down for good. Crowds of fans showed up for a last hurrah on the night of March 31st. But after midnight, on April 1st, the owner revealed that he was not closing after all. It seemed like an April Fool's joke, but the Tennessean reported on April 2nd that Tootsie's was, in fact, closing. Different owners operated today. Back in 2010, we began reprinting old newspaper articles about the Civil War. Each month you could read local coverage of the war from exactly 150 years earlier. At the end of the war coverage, we kept on going, right into the Reconstruction era. So in the April 2018 issue, you can read about Nashville in April 1868. One article, headlined Lady Clerks, argues for hiring women to work as store clerks, saying that they are, quote, obviously better fitted for that work than the sterner sex. At 280, drunkenness topped the list of causes for arrest, according to a quarterly report published at the time. Assault and battery and keeping houses of ill fame were runners-up. 56 people were charged with using abusive language. Also in April 1868, a tornado hit near Nashville. The article says that a, quote, rumbling, groaning, unearthly sound was heard as if a section of the lower world was driving through the dark, thick sky. Definitely different from today, especially with no mention of sounding like a freight train. By the way, the word tornado was not used in the article. It was called a hurricane. My personal favorite 1868 article in this issue is titled Colored Men of Property. The Daily Press and Times newspaper was sympathetic to the plight of freedmen, so they published a list of black men who had acquired a significant amount of property after the war, which was no small feat. For example, A.L. Tate was born free. Albert McKay was freed by the war. Frank Aiken had purchased his freedom and that of his wife and 3 children in the early 1850s. All of these men were paying taxes on property valued between $5,000 and $10,000. At the time, however, the Louisville Journal was not impressed. It challenged the Press and Times to also publish a list of colored men who are, quote, not worth a continental dash and never will be. In response, the Press and Times promised to do so, on the condition that the Louisville Journal publish a list of, quote, white Kentucky Democrats who are not worth a room in hell, adding that such a list would be livelier reading than its stupid editorials. Along with old newspaper articles like these, the Nashville Retrospect also has new essays by local historians. In the April 2018 issue, Tom Henderson writes about the parakeet craze of the 1950s and 60s. The fad was so popular that local stores like Grant's and Woolworth's stocked hundreds of these birds. Want to see evidence of it today? Next time you're in Hillsboro Village, look for the Jones Pet Shop sign above Fido Restaurant. The sign features a dog in his doghouse, and on top of the doghouse is a parakeet. Sports historian Bill Trauber tells the story of the Nashville Seraphs, the city's professional baseball team, in 1895. They won the pennant that year, but not without controversy, one involving an umpire who called a Seraph player out after a kid threw a baseball glove onto the field. In the Artifacts column, Clinton Holloway features a 1955 letter by Delbert Mann to former fellow members of the Nashville Community Playhouse, which was located in the Belcourt Theater. Mann was a Hollywood movie director born in Nashville, and that same year he won the Academy Award for Best Picture for his film Marty. And finally, historian Paul Clements researched a house that used to stand on Macklemore Street, today the site of a huge new development at Broadway and 10th. It was once the residence of Jesse Babcock Ferguson, a Christian church preacher who raised a few eyebrows when he called the idea of eternal damnation a, quote, hideous fable of a barbarous age. The eyebrows rose higher still when he later converted to spiritualism. To see article excerpts and photographs from some of these and other stories, visit our Facebook page. You can pick up the latest issue of the Retrospect for only $1 at local grocery stores and markets. And at www.nashvilleretrospect.com, you can order subscriptions and even back issues. So if you're new to the Retrospect or skipped an issue, check out our webpage to see what you've missed. A main feature of the Nashville Retrospect podcast will be interviews with local historians and with people who have witnessed the city's history firsthand. Our inaugural interview is a little of both. Larry Brinton was born in Nashville in 1930. He grew up in the Hillsboro Village and Belmont areas, going to school at Aiken, Waverly Belmont, and West End High. After finishing school, he joined the Navy and served during the Korean War. On returning home, he got a job at the Nashville Banner, mainly because he had learned how to use a typewriter in the Navy. After a few months of writing obituaries, he was promoted to police reporter, even though he didn't yet know where the police station was located. Fortunately for us, he found the station and went on to write for many decades, covering some of the biggest crime stories in the city's history. He won awards in journalism for investigative stories that exposed corruption in both private and government organizations. Later in his career, he worked for local television news channels 4 and 5, and in retirement, he revisited many of his stories by writing over 90 articles for the Nashville Retrospect. Larry recently sat down with me for an interview in his home. I asked if his reporting ever got him into trouble.
Being the way I was, it kind of kept me in trouble, even with people at the newspaper. I remember one of our society editors came to me and said she'd been to the United Cerebral Palsy for lunch. And she said, you know, they served me on silver trays and all this fancy stuff, and all they talked about was they needed money. And I'm wondering, how could they be serving me like this, need money? Would you go take a look at it? So I said, yes. So I went to my managing editor, and I just said, hey, do you mind if I take a look at United Cerebral Palsy to see what's going on out there? Oh, no, go right ahead. No problem. Go right ahead. Well, I did. TBI joined the investigation. First thing they found was my managing editor's name on their payroll. He was getting paid to keep good stories in the paper. Well, they arrested 3 of them, two employees. The director and the assistant director were convicted and given prison sentences in the workhouse in Nashville. The managing editor, he ended up having to pay back $4,600, I believe. But
he was taking money
to keep good stories. But I'm convinced the Tennessean people were doing the same, but John Siegenthaler didn't force them to pay the money back.
But so you broke the story on your own.
Well, we were. Well, I'm not going to run a story, but 3 people at United States were Paul that were arrested for taking their money. If I wasn't going to write about my own managing editor, so no, I did a story about him, and he didn't get fired. He got demoted and so on, but he was real close to a lot of members of the staff, and if they needed $25 or $30, he'd write up an expense thing for $25 or $30 for them for expenses or something, and they hated it when I did it. But if I'm gonna be in the job, I got to do what I'm supposed to do. So I think that some of them didn't much care for me, and particularly when I became a managing editor. If I'd have been smart, I'd have not taken that job. I'd have stayed doing what I was doing because I enjoyed that so much.
The Nashville Banner, which shut down in 1998, was an afternoon paper. Its rival was the morning paper, the Tennessean. The competition between the two newspapers was fierce.
Everything the Banner was for, the Tennessean was against. Everything the Tennessean was for, the Banner was against. That was that way, as long as I can remember. I know back when they were having the fight over daylight saving time, there was a big clock out on the sidewalk in front of the newspaper. And, of course, both newspapers were in the same building. On our side of the clock, we had it set in daylight saving time. No, we had it regular time. Tennessean had daylight saving time. It's just, it was like that. And, I look at the way news is covered now, and it's often one-sided. Well, it was back then, too. The Tennessean had their candidate, and we didn't like them. And we wrote everything bad we could find out about them. The Banner, we had our candidates. Same thing with Tennessee, and they wrote everything bad they could tell on our candidate. And it was like that as long as I can remember.
And people may not know that you guys shared the same building. Basically, only a hallway separated the
There was
Tennessee.
A little hallway. And, we weren't supposed to go over there into their newsroom, and they were not supposed to come into our newsroom. But one night, late at night, the janitor was cleaning up our side, and he noticed someone from Tennessee standing beside the city desk, and he had a screwdriver, and he was going into one of the drawers. And what had happened was one of the reporters had written a story for the next day and had put it in that drawer to be run the next day. Well, the reporter took the story out of the drawer, and that caused a lot of problems. That reporter, incidentally, later went to work at the New York Times and won a Pulitzer Prize. Yeah, there's things like that, though. It happened. That was the way newspapers were. It wasn't the way that newspapers were supposed to be. It was the way it was.
But the Tennessean wasn't the only competitor. There was that time in the 70s when Elvis was in town.
Elvis never recorded until about midnight or later. He always waited late. So we were going to be out there, and the policemen that were guarding him, we knew. And in fact, he had told me that Elvis would leave about midnight. There was a car parked out in the parking lot outside this motel, and we decided it was National Enquirer, and they were waiting for the same thing. At one point, we'd been there maybe 45 minutes an hour, and they all of a sudden backed up real quick and spun their tires and headed that way from the parking lot. Well, we thought they were probably trying to lure us out. And so when they came back, they went inside. Bill and I and this photographer sat in his car for a few minutes. Then I slipped out and went over and let the air out of their tires. That's just the way I was. I wanted the story, and I wanted it first and only.
Larry proved just how far he was willing to go to get the scoop on a story in November of 1973, when Grand Ole Opry star David Aikman, better known as Stringbean, was murdered. 2 cousins, John and Doug Brown, were arrested after police connected them to items stolen from Stringbean's home.
I got a call from Joe Binkley, who was a well-known Nashville lawyer, and he said, "Can you meet me at the workhouse?" And I said, "Sure, I'd go anywhere, John." he wanted me to meet him. So I went out to the workhouse, and he had Douglas Brown in a cell with him. And I went in, and Doug Brown confessed to the murder. And I sat in the workhouse cell with him and his attorney for an hour or more, just writing down everything he said happened. He gave all the details. And the details were that he and his cousin John were going to rob Stringbean because Stringbean was an unusual person. He didn't believe in banks, and he carried most of his money in his overalls, the old kind of overalls, and so they thought that they would rob him. Well, Stringbean had a security system at his farmhouse, and that security system was he had a string tied on a post at his driveway, and if anybody broke that string, he knew somebody was in the house because it was the string was across from one post to the other at the driveway. And so he knew something was going on, but he pulled his Cadillac, because back then people like that all drove Cadillacs, and he drove and went up to the door, and he had his gun out. And when he went in, the shooting started, and he shot several times, and John shot, and Doug. Then his wife was still in the Cadillac parked outside the house. So John goes out, and she jumps out of the car and starts running. John's chasing her, and he shoots her in the back. Well, she fell down, and then he got over her, standing over top of her, and shot her one more time and killed her. Well, after telling me all that story, I didn't want the Tennessean to know it, and it would, if I told it to the police, that's what would happen. Now, I took Sherman Nickens, who was then chief homicide detective and a photographer while I was at the Banner, and the next morning we went out to this pond where they had thrown the satchel. It had a lot of personal effects of string beans and some checks and different things. We went to this pond, and I couldn't find it. So I went back home and called and found out exactly where it was, and they had placed it up against a dam on this pond. So we went back out the next morning and went in and found it and took it to Sherman's house. Sherman had a swimming pool, and we laid it all out along the swimming pool, and when we got through drying it out, it was too late for my addition. So if I turned it into the police, I would lose the story. Well, I took Sherman there for that very reason, because Sherman was a detective, and it was always in the police's custody. He had a police car, and it was in his police car. Well, the next morning, I got a call from a lawyer who represented John Brown, who was the other one, saying that a lot of us are going out to the pond. We hear that Stringbean's satchel with a lot of information is there. And I said, I don't know what you're talking about. I just have to call you back. Well, I had no intention of calling him back. But a little while later, I got a call and said the district attorney and the police chief and all these, they had divers, they had everybody out there. So I said, heck, I better go out there and see what's going on. So I go out there and I park right next to where Tom Shriver, the DA, parked, and I sat on the trunk of the police car, and Tom was sitting on the trunk of his DA car, and we watched him dive and watched him. Well, I had it in the trunk of the car, what they was looking for, and they dove for hours and hours and hours, and they never could find it. Of course they couldn't, because I had it. And I turned it in the next morning after the Tennessean's deadline. Got a lot of people got upset over it. But hey, I'm in the business, and that was the business of getting the first story first.
Funeral home attendants found $3,000 hidden in a secret pocket in Stringbean's overalls, and another $2,000 was hidden in his wife's bra. But what about the money hidden in the house that the killers had been searching for?
Several years later, they sold the house, and some fellow bought it, and he put a fire in the fireplace, and the charred money started floating down out of the chimney, and they missed that. So they didn't get very much. And it certainly wasn't worth what the 30 years or so that they put in the prison.
In April of 1963, a man named John B. Wilson was killed by his wife during a domestic dispute. The case is remembered for the weapon that was used.
I got a call one night about, I don't know, must have been 9:30, 10 o'clock, a little bit later maybe, that one of the big homes next to the Belmead Theater, there had been something that happened. And so I went. What had happened was that the gentleman that lived there with his wife and stepson, the man and his wife had gone to a party in Belmead. And when he got home, the father didn't get along with his stepson. They just had a disagreement all the time. And the son's mother jumped up on the bed while an argument was going on between her son and her husband. And there was a samurai sword on the wall as a decoration. And she grabbed that thinking she would change the tempo of the room. And she acted like Errol Flynn and flipping the sword around and around. And as she went forward, her husband, who was standing beside the bed, lunged in. And of course, it went right through him. They charged her with murder, and she got out immediately on bond. And I was subpoenaed to the grand jury. You know, I knew what was going to happen. The foreman of the grand jury lived in Belmead. He was an insurance man. And she was from Belmead. And you just kind of difficult, I guess, to charge somebody from Belmead if you live in Belmead. I could tell by the questions that nothing was going to happen, and that's what did happen, nothing. They gave a no true bill, which ended the case. But it was one of the strangest cases I've been on.
Now, if I remember correctly, when you got the call about that, you went directly to the house.
Went directly to the house, and I walked in with the medical examiner. Back in those days, I guess some police thought I was a lieutenant or something. I don't know. But wherever they went, I would go. Nowadays, reporters can't get within a block of where there's been a murder. They do everything to cover it up. But back then, they just expected me to be there. And I'd go right where they were. And when I walked in the house, there he was laying on the floor in the bedroom with a knife still protruding from his. Not a nice scene. But I didn't see a lot of nice scenes, a lot of things that I wish I hadn't seen, but you see them. But you got to report about it, and I didn't make a habit of seeing everything, some things, but I went on so many murder cases. Nashville had an awful lot of murder cases back then.
One of those murders made front-page headlines in May 1968. Bill Powell claimed that while he and his Capital Chevrolet business partner, Haney Gurley, were out for a ride, a robber jumped into their car and shot them both. Gurley died as a result, and though Powell himself was shot, he was charged with murder.
He was shot in the skin part of his leg.
You're talking about Powell.
Bill Powell is. When he went to the hospital, they told Bill, "Now don't wash your hands because we got to do some fingerprinting." And Sherman Dickens said the first thing Bill did was went in and washed his hands. But the trial was actually lost in the court. The final arguments are very important. And Tom Shriver was the prosecutor, and he had decided that he would forego his opening and let the defense have theirs, and then he would have the end of it. So he waived his first argument. And the lawyers for Bill said, "Give it to the jury." So he didn't argue, and that meant Tom couldn't argue the case. I think Bill did it. I volunteered over St. Thomas Hospital for 10 years, and Bill was over there a lot for his own illness and for a family member's illness. And he'd stop by and talk to me. Not about that, of course. But in my mind, Bill shot Haney Gurley. Shot himself in the calf of the leg where it wasn't any damage. Haney Gurley's wife became very close to me. But she was heartbroken when they didn't do anything.
9-year-old Marcia Trimble disappeared on February 25th, 1975. It wasn't the first such case. Just a few years earlier, 12-year-old Kathy Jones had been found in Woodbine, brutally raped and murdered. But the Trimble case had a bigger impact on the city, perhaps because she was from a more affluent and, presumably, safer part of town. Trimble's body was eventually found, too, 33 days later on Easter Sunday.
The day that her father called Sherman Nickens, my friend, the detective chief, homicide chief, I went out to the house, and we offered a reward at the newspaper. I don't know, it was $5,000, $1,000. I can't remember how much, but I became pretty close to Marcia's mother, Virginia. And throughout the time while the body was still missing, I would speak to her and talk to her. I remember that Easter morning, they found the body in a garage no more than 100 yards or so from their home where she disappeared from. And I thought it was very strange. They found it in this garage, hidden beneath one of those plastic swimming pools that had been stored in the garage. And I thought it was awful funny because one day I was standing, before they found the body, I was standing at the door of the garage, and they had brought police dogs from Pennsylvania to Nashville to search for the body. Anyway, I'm standing right at the garage door. It's open, and those dogs walk right past me, didn't turn their heads toward the garage or anything. They were within 3 feet of me. And there her body was behind me. And I always thought that was strange. It made me wonder whether or not her body was really there at that time. I always felt that the body wasn't there then, that she was taken somewhere else, and months later, sometime later, was brought in there. During the trial of the suspect, Virginia Trimble, who was Marcia's mother, wanted me to sit with her during the trial. And I told her I couldn't do that. I can't show partiality. She'd have to get somebody else to sit with her. I mean, I liked her and all of that, but that's not for me.
Jerome Barrett was convicted of Trimble's murder in 2009 and sentenced to 44 years in prison. Kathy Jones's murderer has never been found. Larry Brinton may be known for his crime reporting, but he also covered historic events in Nashville like the Civil Rights Movement. In February 1960, when the sit-in protests began, the publisher of the Nashville Banner, James Stallman, was not pleased.
Jimmy Stallman was always nice to me, but he had his quirks. And the staff had to abide by everything he said. For instance, he was on the board of trust at Vanderbilt University. We were not allowed to write any bad story about Vanderbilt University. He was in the Navy. We could not write any bad story about the United States Navy. The church that he went to, First Presbyterian Church, same thing. He had a bunch of things that we just could not write about. When the sit-in started, Mr. Stallman thought that if they were just wanting publicity, and if we didn't give them the publicity, it would quickly go away. Well, I was still assigned to cover everything, every sit-in, every meeting, everything they did. But I just took notes and never got to write a story about it. The sit-in demonstrators, and there was probably 75 of them, I guess. Well, I guess now, that's been so long ago. But they would walk from a church. It was located at 8th and Union, that area. It's a predominantly black church. And they would all walk from there. And they were all from TSU and Meharry and those colleges. And they'd walk from there downtown. For instance, one of the targets was Woolworths. And we'd all stand out front of it to see what the police were going to do. Sit-in demonstrators marched in, and they all took a chair up by the counter, took a stool. And there was a red-headed fella that looked like he was probably 23, 24. And he had meanness in his eyes. You could tell something was going to happen. And police knew that. They knew that he was going to cause problems, but they didn't do anything. Eventually, they let him and some others inside Woolworths, and he stood behind one of the sit-in demonstrators who was seated at the council, and it wasn't long till he grabbed him and roughed him up good. And I thought, they didn't have to do that. There wasn't any reason. Now, not all policemen were involved like that, but a lot were. And they did arrest him, but maybe a $50 fine or something like that's all he got, maybe not even that. But they did what they said they were going to do. It was going to be peaceful. They didn't strike back or do anything. I remember one Sunday morning I got a call here at the home, and Dahlman wanted me to come out to his house. There's going to be a meeting at his house on that Sunday morning. And so I drive out to his home, and there was, 5 or 6 of us there. He told me he wanted me to go and buy Army helmets, bulletproof vests, mace, wanted me to get all of this stuff for the photographers. And that's what I did. I got it. So every photographer had that kind of equipment with them. Of course, they never used them. Right behind the newsroom, about 10 feet, was a room, which is a coat room, except they had a chest in there of some sort. In it, there was 2 guns. There was a shotgun. I think it's a rifle. They were there because Mr. Stallman thought that the sit-in demonstrators were going to storm the banner. Of course, they never did. And, as I look back on it, I saw a lot of things that I didn't really know were going on, wasn't paying that much attention, but he felt very strongly against the sit-in demonstration. I don't think he ever really relented. There was one time there was a sit-in demonstration at 9th and Church outside Varela's restaurant. And, of course, Varela did not allow blacks to eat in his restaurant. And they sat down in the street, about 45 minutes an hour. And all of a sudden, the police were around, kind of guarding, watching. All of a sudden, one of them yelled, "Let's get them." And they started chasing them. And the last I remember of that, there was about 4 or 5 policemen chasing them up Church Street, up Capitol Boulevard. And they were, the sit-in demonstrators were running as fast as they could. You have to feel sorry for them. And so, while you could feel sorry for them, you couldn't say anything about it. Tennessean wrote stories about it every day. But it was a time of our lives.
Our thanks to Larry for the interview. We have more to share from our discussion in future episodes. The song you heard at the opening of the show is called Golden Slippers. It and other slave songs and spirituals were popularized after the Civil War by the Fisk Jubilee Singers, who, starting in 1871, toured America and Europe, performing to raise money for Fisk University, a historically black college located in Nashville. The group was made up of Fisk students, most of whom were also former slaves. The song is about wearing one's best shoes as you go to join the heavenly choir. Perhaps it's not surprising, then, to find instances in the 1880s where the song was played at executions. For example, in Atlanta in 1883, a man condemned to be hanged specifically requested that Golden Slippers be performed as he fell through the trap. This recording of Golden Slippers features the Fisk Jubilee Quartet, a group created later after the original Fisk Jubilee singers had disbanded. One of the quartet's shows here took place at the Hippodrome, the skating rink and events venue that used to be located on West End, across from Centennial Park. The Nashville Tennessean reported that half of the 50-cent admission for the show was donated to Fisk University. The men's quartet included J.A. Myers, A.G. King, N.W. Ryder, and J.W. Work II, who organized and promoted the group. In 1909, the Victor Talking Machine Company in Camden, New Jersey, hired the Fisk Jubilee Quartet to record a number of their spirituals, including Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and Golden Slippers. Music historian Tim Brooks says these recordings spread across the country and that people everywhere bought them. including people who never would have allowed a black person in their front parlor. Here now is the Fisk Jubilee Quartet singing Golden Slippers.
What kind of shoes you're going to wear? Golden slippers. What kind of shoes you're going to wear? Golden slippers. Golden slippers. I'm bound to wear the glittering sun. Oh yes, 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 my Lord, I'm going to join the heavenly choir. Yes, 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 my Lord, soldier of the cross. Oh yes, 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 my Lord, I'm going to join the heavenly choir. Yes, 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 my Lord, soldier of the cross. What kind of crown you're going to wear? Starry crown. What kind of crown you're going to wear? Starry crown.
Thank you for listening to the first episode of the Nashville Retrospect podcast. For more information about the stories you heard, see the show notes on the podcast webpage, which you can find a link to at www.nashvilleretrospect.com. You can also send your comments and suggestions using the contact form there, or email us directly at nashretroshow@gmail.com. This show was written and produced by me, Allen Forkum, but I had a lot of help. I do extensive research at local archives, such as the Tennessee State Library and Archives, the Nashville Public Library's Banner Archives, and the Metro Archives. These wonderful institutions are dedicated to preserving local history, and they have an expert staff ready to help you research your own history projects. A quick note of gratitude to our readers and sponsors. You help keep the Retrospect going, and we need more of you both, so please spread the word. Also, thanks to my father, Garnet Forkum, and to my brother, Barry. Their work at Autographic Publishing Company also keeps the Retrospect going, and we happen to be celebrating our 30th year in business. And finally, a special thanks to Sonia Bohannon. Without her advice and encouragement, this podcast would not have been possible. So stay tuned for the next episode, and in the meantime, don't forget to pick up your copy of the Nashville Retrospect.